Hey everybody, welcome back, or for those of you that are new, my name is Susan. I am a freelance fiction editor specializing in science fiction, fantasy, and romance. So throughout making all of these videos, I throw terms around, and really anytime you're reading blogs or talking to people in publishing or anything like that, we all tend to throw random publishing terms around and assume everyone knows what we're talking about. And that may not be the case, or people's definitions may differ. So this week, I thought we could go through some of the top common publishing terms that I see that get mistaken for something else, or a bit confusing, or may overlap but actually mean different things, everything like that. So the first, and probably one of the biggest I see, is the definition between Galley, ARC, and ABM, or Advanced Bound Manuscript. So all of these things can technically mean the same thing, and everybody sort of uses them interchangeably within publishing, bloggers, readers, anybody like that. But they do actually mean different things. If you're looking at it in sort of a hierarchy way, it goes ARC, Galley, and then ABM, Advanced Bound Manuscript. So an ARC is a really finished, well-produced product. So it generally has a cover of its own, or it's so close to the end product that it actually already has the finished product cover on it. So for example, I have one. This is sort of an old comp, but I have The Darkest Minds, which this is one of the original covers that they use, but you can tell from the top that this is an ARC. You can see it on the side there, 2012. That tells you how long I've been collecting ARCs and Galleys, which I do like to keep on my shelves. Or one from Orbit where I worked. This is a book by Will McIntosh. It was a great book if you have not read it. This is one where this wasn't the final cover. This is a part of the final cover, actually, this image right here, as well as many times on ARCs, instead of the title being the biggest, because you do want it to feel like an early copy still, many times either the hook or a tagline or something like that is going to be bigger, and then the author and title is going to be down below, but you can still tell, like here, see if I can get that to focus, that it has the pub date, everything down here, so it doesn't have an ISBN, it doesn't have a barcode, so you can still tell that this is an early copy. So that's what ARCs look like. Galleys are sort of a step down from that. They are generally a product that is done relatively early to the middle of the production phase. So it could have a cover, but most likely it's going to look something like this, where it's just a very basic cover. It doesn't have any artwork on it. It's just the title and author and any other details on it, and the back cover copy. And it is bound. It has been generally formatted, so you can see this looks like a book inside. It looks like what the book will look like inside on the final version, but this isn't a fancy cover or anything like that. This is meant really to just get this book out there as quickly as possible, to get reviews, to get people reading, to get sort of hype going, everything like that. And then the third is the ABM, which is Advanced Bound Manuscript. I actually don't, unfortunately, have any examples to show you of that because it is such an early copy. I don't generally feel the need to keep them, but generally what those are is literally the Word document manuscript shrunk down and bound at the publisher or at Kinko's or wherever you want to have them. It generally just has a white sheet of paper that says the title and the name on it. It is not fancy at all. It generally hasn't gone through proofs or copy edits. It's not formatted in any way. Again, the earliest copy you can get out, generally to people that you really think are going to be able to push your book or support it moving forward, or you want feedback in any way, shape, or form. So again, all of these terms can kind of be used interchangeably. Everybody's definitions differ a little bit, but they do actually have different definitions and different ways of coming across depending on when they were produced and how well they were produced, whether or not they have a cover, whether or not they're formatted on the inside, everything like that. So it is something to keep in mind as you're talking to publishers, as you're creating your own ARCs or Galleys or anything like that. Those terms can mean different things to people. Number 2 is self-publishing versus indie publishing. Now, a lot of people use these interchangeably, and they do overlap. I myself sometimes use them interchangeably, but they can mean different things, because self-publishing means you yourself. You are self-publishing. You are putting your own book out there. Versus indie publishing generally means anything outside of the big 5 in New York. So HarperCollins, Hachette, Penguin Random House, anything like that. So, it can mean a lot of indie presses, vanity presses, people that are publishing books but aren't necessarily self-publishing. And the reason this distinction is important is because there's a lot of industry news, there's a lot of hashtags, social media, everything like that, that support indie, support local, everything like that. And those are all phenomenal, but they don't necessarily mean self-publishing. And many times I think some people get a little bit confused of what those different terms mean, how they overlap, and how they differ. Number 3 is imprint versus publisher. So this is sort of like talking about a genre versus a subgenre. So when authors go out there and they say, oh, I've been published by so-and-so, it is important sometimes to know whether or not they're talking publisher or whether they're talking imprint, because imprint is going to tell you what specifically they're publishing. So Orbit versus Forever, so sci-fi fantasy versus romance, but those people are both being published by Hachette Book Group. So it is something that you want to keep in mind just as you're talking to industry people, so you know the difference, especially if you're starting to reach out to agents, have that conversation, everything like that. Having that knowledge, knowing the difference, and knowing the different imprints within the publishing houses is important so you can understand what they're talking about when you start to put together your pitches, when you start to reach out to publishers, when you start to imagine where you want your books to go, how and what market. Line editing versus copy editing. This is something that I run into a lot on the self-publishing / freelance side of things, but it is also important to know for the traditional side as well, the difference between line editing and copy editing, because they are different things. So copy editing is very well known. Obviously, every author I know wants to have a copy editor, wants to make sure their grammar and spelling and everything like that is correct. And that is certainly something I highly recommend. You want to make sure your manuscript is as clean as possible. But before you go into copy editing, depending on how you feel about your writing and your prose, you may want to consider a line edit as well. So a line edit dives more into the craft, into the writing aspect versus the grammar and spelling technicalities. So for line editing, I may talk about how your scene transitions work, if they're sort of abrupt or if they flow smoothly, your sentence structure, your crutch words, how you may use description, if anything is sort of repetitive, if you are using enough variables within your writing to make the tension come through in that way, or if it's feeling a bit stilted because you've used short sentences, so if it's feeling very choppy, or if you've repeatedly used long sentences and it's feeling very long-winded, everything like that. Now, these are things that a copy editor can fix and might, but generally they don't dive into anything that's more craft style. They're looking for the technical aspects. Is that sentence correct? Yes, it may not be the best way to put it, but they're not going to mess with it because they don't want to mess with your voice, your writing style. Versus a line editor might work with you more on that. So they want to dive in and say, I see where you're going with this. What if you phrased it this way to highlight this? Or what if you said it this way to avoid repeating said or shoulders or eyes, because you have that several times earlier on this page. Something like that, where they're really diving into the nuts and bolts before then you want to dive into copy editing and make sure everything is correct in that way. Most everybody needs copy editing. I highly recommend it. As I mentioned before, not everybody needs a line edit, but it is a really great idea, especially if you're trying a new genre, or maybe you just really had a hard time with the novel and it felt a bit stilted as you were writing it. A line editor can really help you find those areas and make it flow even better. Again, this is generally on the self-publishing side of things, but a traditional publisher will probably take you through that process as well. You're just not paying for it out of pocket. So it is important to know that difference, to know whether or not that's something you want, and to not expect a line editor to copy edit, and to not expect a copy editor to line edit. Dialogue tags versus action tags. This is something that I don't know that people necessarily misunderstand the terms, but it is something where in writing people confuse these two quite a bit. So a dialogue tag is something where it's explaining to the reader how the character said something. So she sighed, he questioned, they whispered, anything like that. An action tag, or an action beat, is explaining what the character was doing surrounding or during the speech. So generally a physical action, something that they are doing, not necessarily how they are saying something. So you can really tell the difference in this in the stories that you're reading by looking at the narrative surrounding your dialogue and seeing whether or not it's separated off by a comma or a period. So if it's a comma, generally you say, dialogue, comma, he said. Dialogue, comma, she whispered, something like that. If it's dialogue, period, and then you see somebody walking away or cackling as they move direction here, A or B, something like that, those are action beats. You're explaining the action of the story surrounding the dialogue. It's not connected to the dialogue, hence the period. So this is something that the lines get mixed up a little bit because depending on the action, it could feel like it should be connected to the dialogue, but you still want to have that period because you're not using a dialogue tag, you're not explaining how they said something, you're explaining an action connected to it. So you want to make sure you're being as clear as possible within that, even though it's a very small difference, because it can make a huge deal to your readers in their understanding of what's happening and how you are explaining that story to them so that they have a clear vision of what's going on. So something to keep in mind, definitely something to check out as you read your next book so you can sort of see the difference in action. So you can see the difference in how your favorite authors are using them. Finally, goal versus motivation. So this is a bit more craft than publishing terminology necessarily, but I really thought it was important to talk about because it is something that people sort of mesh together as one big thing when they talk about their writing and their story and their characters, and they really are two very separate points that you want to make sure you've plotted out or thought about in your mind. If you're not a plotter, that's perfectly fine, before you dive in or while you're diving in, to make sure you have that touch point for your characters. So a goal is what your character wants. What are they working towards? What do they in the end want? Versus a motivation is their why. Why are they doing this? Why are they the way they are? Why do they want that goal? And while they can overlap and be similar, in some respects they can be very different. Side note, character motivation and goal can evolve and change during your story, but you always want to make sure it is the forefront of what your character is doing and why as it evolves. A great example of not only the why and how, but also the evolving why and how goal and motivation is Home Alone. So Home Alone, his goal is to be left alone, to get rid of his family, everything like that. And his motivation, his reasoning, is how horrible they treat him. By the way, they horribly treat this boy. He's not exactly the nicest person in the world either, but holy cow, that family dynamics and how big that family is. Good gracious. Anyway, so his goal is to be left alone, which of course then evolves into protecting his home and wanting his family to come back, and his why is because he truly does feel a part of that family. He does love his family and he does want them to return. He wants them to return to him and to a happy Christmas-filled home that hasn't been robbed. You want to keep these things in mind to make sure your reader is understanding your character and their actions. So while you don't want them to be predictable, when they do make those choices, when they do act and move forward, the reader can think, okay, I understand that. He did XYZ because he wanted to reach this goal. He did XYZ because he was feeling this, because this happened. And those sort of merge together to funnel you towards the main conflict, and they funnel you towards the end clash of the story. Again, they can overlap and they can be very intimately connected, but they are two different things that you want to keep in mind to make sure you're clear, and that clarity in how you're having your world built, your characters act, everything like that is coming through clearly to the reader. Hopefully this has been helpful. If you have any questions, or if there are any terms that you've run into where you're like, I don't know what that means, or I used that wrong, or what in the world are they talking about, I would love to chat with you about them. Feel free to reach out. My information is below, or leave a comment. That would be awesome as well. You can like and subscribe. It super helps the channel. And until next week, keep writing.